Good morning.
So, hello everybody. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Stanley Sankoff. I'm the Funds Capacity Building Manager, and in a moment I'll introduce our presenters this morning. In the interest of time, I'll just ask that folks introduce yourselves in the chat. You can go ahead and drop your name, pronouns, any organizational affiliations or hats you'd like to mention, hats you're wearing if you'd like to mention, and where you're calling in from. For those of you that are new to us, the Fund for Santa Barbara is a community foundation, and we work on advancing progressive change by strengthening movements for social, political, economic, and environmental justice in the Santa Barbara County region. And we do this through 5 main strategies. We make grants, supporting long-term movements and emerging needs, nurture coalitions. We influence the broader philanthropic sector, and we develop movement leadership. And the main reason why we're here today, we help build capacity of progressive organizations to help us all be more bold and effective in our work. And we do that through workshops like this, through a regional equity study, individual consulting, with resources. Oh, sorry about that. You know, I can definitely speak a little bit slower. Maybe I've had too much coffee this morning. And as always, I would love to hear any topics or experts that you'd like us to bring to these trainings, and always want to hear how we can best support you in your work. So please stay in touch, and you'll have my information afterwards as well. And a couple of just small housekeeping items. Please know we are recording this training for anyone who missed it. And if any sensitive discussion comes up, please know you can email me afterwards, and I'll be sure to edit that out of the recording. And we'll keep this free phone conversation as much as we can in a virtual space. But so please feel free to raise your hand, whether that's your actual hand or your Zoom hand, and drop a comment in the chat or unmute yourself when you'd like to speak. And just know we'll have a little bit of a Q&A time, about 15 to 20 minutes before the end. So please feel free to drop your questions for our presenters in the chat anytime. I'll be collecting those and those. So again, I'm so excited to introduce Nona and Tom. The Alliance for Justice Bold Advocacy Program is really a huge supporter for us in this region and in the state. This topics of lobbying and advocacy for nonprofits and related, a whole list of related topics that they are the foremost organization for. They are certainly an organization I reach out to all the time that is trusted, responsive, and aligned with our values. And we've had the pleasure of bringing Nona actually for a number of years now, and also refer folks to her all the time, especially as the election season and stuff, but also well beyond that, which we'll get into today. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Nona.
Thank you so much, Stanley. It's really nice to be here with you all this morning. My name is Nona. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the California Director for Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Sham Subramanian. Sham, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what your role will be today in the session?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sham Subramanian, he, him pronouns, and I'm Senior Counsel with the Boulder Advocacy Program based in Northern California. Today, I'll just be supporting Nona, helping to answer questions, as well as putting in a short survey that we'd ask you to complete at the end of this training. So, you will be, if you have questions as they come up, please feel free to put those in the chat box.
Thank you, Sham. He oftentimes will help me clarify or say something in a more clear way. And we just I find it's more fun when I get to have my friend and colleague Sham on here with me when we speak about these fun topics. So thank you for joining. Let me tell you a little bit about Alliance for Justice and Boulder Advocacy as a little bit of context, and then we'll launch in to the session today. So Alliance for Justice is a national nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have staff in Southern California. I'm in Los Angeles. In Northern California, Sham is in San Francisco. And we have staff in Texas, as well as in our headquarters in DC. We have a few different programs that are part of our organization. Particularly, we're well known for our work around the importance of the federal judiciary to policymaking and the need for a diverse federal judiciary that represents everyday Americans, which is something we do a lot of work in, especially out of our DC office. But our program where Sham and I work is called Boulder Advocacy. It's Boulder just with an O. We're not from the city in Colorado or anything like that. But we're helping you all to be bold and brave advocates. So we work to support and encourage nonprofits and foundations to engage in advocacy work. And we primarily do that through helping to clarify the legal framework that allows and permits nonprofits and foundations to advocate. So Sham and I are attorneys. We have a team of attorneys around the country that we're part of. We're not your attorney. So we're not attorneys for actually any nonprofits because we're not a law firm. Our model is an educational model. So we do a lot of trainings like this one. We have a lot of fact sheets and publications that you can find on our boulderadvocacy.org website, and we'll send out some after the session as well. We also have a hotline that I just want to let you know about, which is that you see that information there at advocacy@afj.org and the 866 phone number. Our team answers questions for free about laws impacting nonprofit advocacy every business day. So, we have people on call to answer those questions. And so I hope to answer all of your questions today. But if there are questions that you don't think of until tomorrow or the day after, please don't hesitate to reach out and get some clarification to help you move forward in your work. So let's see, I think that means that we are ready to move on. This is what I'm hoping to cover today in our session. So I'm going to start off by just talking about the legal framework that permits public charities to advocate and lobby. I want to make sure that when you leave today, you know why you need to know when you're lobbying. We're going to talk about one easy step that most public charities can take to maximize the amount of advocacy work that they can do. And we're going to focus the later part of the presentation on which activities have to be tracked and reported to the IRS. So this is what I'm planning to cover today. And I will say one thing about questions. I really like when questions come up throughout. So please pop those questions into the chat box. Sham will be watching it for me, and we'll pipe in as relevant if there's something I need to clarify. And then we'll also have a more dedicated time, as Stanley mentioned, towards the end of the session to answer questions as well. So, and then there'll be some points throughout where we'll have some examples and we'll need some audience participation. So keep an ear and an eye out for that as well. Okay, so just to get started, the starting point and why we're here today is just to remind you and to make sure that it's clear that nonprofits and public charities in particular, which is who I think most of our audience is today, can advocate for policy and community change. And public charities can even lobby, which we're going to talk about, right? But just generally speaking, you know, this is what our communities need from us, is to be at the table, to be engaged, to help them participate. And this is, you know, nonprofits are trusted messengers, are trusted parts of their community that really that really need to play this role in helping us to create a better society at this point. And so it's so urgent for all of you to be involved. And we know at Boulder Advocacy that there's a lot of misperception, and there's a sense that nonprofits should not advocate or should not lobby, which is not true. And that's why we're here today, to make sure that we can dispel any misperceptions about that and provide you with tools and a framework to move forward. So, sorry for the background noise there. I hope it's gonna abate a little bit. It's an exciting school morning in my home. So, what are some, when I say advocacy, what am I talking about? Well, for us at Boulder Advocacy, advocacy is a really broad concept. It's not something that has a particular formal or legal definition, but we think of all the things that you see on your screen right now as advocacy, and even more, right? So these are just some of the things that we think of as advocacy. So, you know, you see things like research and building relationships with legislators and organizing and voter education, lobbying and supporting opposing candidates, lots of different kinds of activities that we think of as advocacy. And you also see that we have them kind of color coded here, right? So I think most folks, well, let me take a step back. Let me tell you that I'm talking about public charities right now. So that is a certain kind of 501c3 organization. It's the most common kind of 501c3 organization. It includes the Fund for Santa Barbara. It includes Alliance for Justice. And it includes, I think, probably most of the organizations that you work with and that you're representing here today. So if you're not sure if you're a 501c3 or if you're a public charity, the main other category of 501c3s is private foundations. So if you don't think you're a private foundation, you're probably a public charity if you're a nonprofit. But even that is the kind of question that we may be able to help you answer on our technical assistance line if you have questions. So there are other kinds of organizations out there, but for 501c3 public charities, which is, like I said, by and large, the largest category, this is the basic framework that you need to keep in mind. I think people are really pretty clear on the fact that 501c3 public charities cannot support or oppose candidates for elected office. So that's what you see under our red light, stoplight. We could talk more, and we often do, about exactly what that means and how to interpret that. And, you know, Stanley and I have talked about the possibility of having a session later in the year, because I know you all have local elections this year. But suffice to say, we know we can't support or oppose candidates for elected public office. We're not going to talk too much about that today, but I want to make sure I just mention it. So then we have all these other activities here. And lobbying is in yellow because it's limited. And we're going to spend the rest of the session today really diving into that, both what is the nature of the limit and what is the definition of lobbying. So we're going to talk about that. But public charities have this as part of their tax exempt status, that lobbying is permitted but limited, right? And that's why we're here today, because that's part of your tax exempt status that you need to understand. At the same time, everything you see there in green is you know, something that a public charity, a 501c3 can do all day, every day. There is no limit to the amount of organizing, to the amount of building relationships with legislators, research. We'll talk about the exceptions to the definition of lobbying, right? All these different kinds of activities that are really also important parts of advocacy that nonprofit public charities can definitely do and are not limited. So we want to help you maximize both your lobbying and all these other activities, advocacy activities in green here. So first of all, what do I mean by lobbying? Well, we're going to spend a large part of the session diving into the details of this, but just to start off, I'm talking about trying to influence specific legislation, including ballot measures. So we're going to talk about that. What's legislation versus what's not legislation? But for right now, just keep in mind, first of all, we're not talking about elected candidates for office. And we're not talking about all the policies in the world. We're only talking about legislation. So this is kind of the ballpark that we're in today. And many times, often when we're trying to make change in our communities. So public charities can lobby. I like to make sure I say it as often as I can. Public charities can lobby. And you see an example here on your screen. Tell Congress to protect Black voters, fully fund safe elections in the HEROES Act. This would be considered a lobbying communication, which is great because we need to have this kind of conversation, right? So public charities can do this. And by the end of the session, you know, I think you're going to have a really good sense, like what's lobbying, what's not lobbying. But if we can lobby, then why are we here, right? Like, why do I need to know this information? So a few things you need to know to be able to lobby in a nonprofit 501c3 public charity. So the first is that there is a limit and you need to stay within that. So we're going to talk about what that is. Second is all lobbying that's done in a 501c3 public charity has to be reported to the IRS on your annual 990 form. And so that means that you have to track staff time and direct costs that relate to your lobbying activity. You can totally handle this. You've got it. I can answer questions about how to track and how to report. You also have to have unrestricted funds. That's the other place where this really comes up, because certain sources of funds that nonprofits use may say, and I don't mean this unrestricted in kind of an accounting sense. What I mean is that there are sources of funds that say that you cannot use certain funds for lobbying. So certainly that would be government funding, generally speaking, and some private foundation funding, but not all. That's going to be all over the map. So you should be looking at the terms of your grant agreements to understand whether each grant says it can or cannot be used for lobbying. This is another area that we can really help with technical assistance. We can help you look at your grant agreements and try to understand what that language means, because they're usually going to mention lobbying in some way, but it doesn't always mean that lobbying is prohibited.
No, there's a question related to tracking.
Great.
And the question is, what records need to be kept by whom in the case of an audit?
Ooh, that's a good question. And one that I probably don't have tons of time to get into detail on, but what I will say is that so you, as a nonprofit public charity, have to report the expenses and in some cases activities that you undertake when you lobby. And that always is going to include staff time. and any direct costs. So direct costs would be things like travel back in the day when we traveled to lobby, or, you know, rented buses to bring people to City Hall. But these days it might include paying a graphic designer to create an infographic for your social media, or postcards that you mail out to people in the community, right? So those would be some direct costs that might be lobbying costs. There are honestly not, the IRS does not provide a ton of detail about the exact kinds of records that need to be kept. They ask us to be reasonable. They ask us to be somewhat consistent so that, you know, it doesn't look like we're changing all the time just to game the system or anything like that. But, you know, having some kind of system within your organization where staff can, whether it's through timesheets or some other mechanism, indicate what time they've spent lobbying, and some kind of system to track when direct costs are attributed to lobbying is really the main thing that you need to have in terms of documentation. So hopefully that's helpful. We can come back to that at the end as well. Thank you, Sean. Hey, look, I had a question slide right here, so perfect. Sean, do you think there's anything else I should cover right now, or should I go on to talk about what the lobbying limits are?
Yeah, I'll just mention that we're happy to take other specific questions related to record keeping, but I put in the chat our publication, Keeping Track, that has practical tips and sample forms to help with tracking and reporting to the IRS. And Nona, there was a question about differences between C3s and C4s. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that now, or.
Yeah, actually it might be good because I don't really have much in the slides about that. So yeah, there's another kind of nonprofit out there. I mean, there are a lot, but there's one that's getting a lot of attention and where we're seeing a lot of growth right now, called a social welfare organization, or 501c4. And 501c4 organizations they're nonprofit, so they're similar in that sense, which means that they don't pay corporate income tax as an organization, right? But they are different from C3s in that they cannot offer a tax-deductible charitable contribution to donors. So when you give money to a 501c3, you, as a donor, expect to be able to deduct that off of your taxes as a charitable contribution. Whereas when you give money to a C4, they have to tell you, actually they have a duty to tell their donors that their donations are not tax deductible as charitable contributions. Because they don't have the same tax benefits as C3s, they do not have the same restrictions on their advocacy activities as C3s. They can do as much lobbying as they want. So, you know, this analysis today about lobbying isn't directly applicable to 501c4s. But they also can do some, but not exclusively, support an opposition of candidates for elected office. There's a lot of other rules that go into that, election law and other tax rules. But so what we see either with, you know, longstanding advocacy organizations, or increasingly there's a lot of growth on this, especially across the progressive spectrum, as we see a lot of 501c3s who are forming or have already 501c4 affiliated organizations. And so they are separate organizations, but they're affiliated. So I think of them as kind of a family of organizations. But you know that not all 501c4s are affiliated. I'll say Alliance for Justice has an affiliated 501c4 called Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. And, you know, for some, that is an effective way to either do more lobbying, or because 501c4s can do as much lobbying as they want, or to do some partisan political activity supporting or opposing candidates for office. So it's just a different kind of organization. They basically have the same rules as like unions or trade associations. That may be people who you work in coalition with a lot. And I think one of the things just to keep in mind is not everyone has the same rules. So just because you get a communication from one of your coalition partners doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, you can pass it on, or that it would be treated the same way in your organization. So hopefully that's a good overview. And maybe if there's more questions about that, we can also come back to that. What do you think, Sham? Did I cover it?
It makes sense. And also let people know that they can contact us for technical assistance if they have questions about C4s.
Yes, definitely. We have a lot of resources and expertise about that. Great. So let's talk about how much lobbying public charities can do, right? So what is this limit? I've said a couple times, there is a limit on how much lobbying. So what is that limit? Well, this is where I get to say, it depends. I'm a lawyer, so it depends. And that's why we're here to explain it, right? When a 501c3 public charity is created, the IRS assigns it one of two tests for measuring and reporting lobbying. It's something that you may not have thought anything about when your organization was formed, or maybe you did. But there are two tests for how lobbying is measured and reported. And one is the default. It's called the insubstantial part test. And really what this says is that lobbying cannot be a more than insubstantial part of your organization's activities. Unfortunately, there is not a clear definition of what is considered to be substantial or insubstantial under this definition. There's not a really great clear definition of lobbying itself either. But I think one of the most important things to understand about this default test, and this is, you know, if you've never talked to the IRS about how you want to measure and report your lobbying, this is the test that applies to you. What people, I feel, don't always understand is that it applies not just to your expenditures, but it applies to your activities. And that means that the IRS considers that people who are not paid staffers of your organization, whether they're board members, whether they're community leaders, volunteers, program participants that you're working with, if they communicate, show up at a meeting, etc., and they say, I'm here with the Fund for Santa Barbara, and we think that you should reinstate the $50,000 in the city budget for people who don't have housing, then they've just lobbied on behalf of your organization, even though they haven't spent any money. And that is something that the IRS wants you to track and report, even if you didn't spend any money on it. So I don't think people always truly understand that aspect of this test. So there really is, this test gets kind of a meh. Gets kind of a shrug emoji from me. Like, you can use it, especially if you need to, if your budget is a certain size, which I'll get to, but there's, for most organizations, there's a better way. And the better way is the 501h expenditure. Morning is something that you have And what that does is it gives you a formula to calculate what your lobbying limit is. And it's very generous. It gives and you with and something team can do to help you make this choice, to help you know where you are in this choice, or helping you find the form, fill it out, talk to your organization to this choice. We're very happy to do that because that's part of our mission, is helping people to navigate this. So if you are under the default test, the lobbying limit is about 3 to 5%. 3 to 5% of what? Again, not just your budget, also your activities. So it's a little hard to identify what that means exactly. It does require extensive reporting and narratives to describe your lobbying activity if you're under the default test. If you're under the expenditure test, what does the limit look like? Well, it's based on your annual exempt purpose expenditures, which is roughly your annual expenditures. And then we get to this formula, right? And you can see that for the smallest organizations of $500,000 annual expenditures or less, it's actually 20% of your annual expenditures that you can spend on lobbying. So right there, you can see that you can spend a lot more on lobbying, especially if you're a smaller organization. You can see that this expenditure caps out for organizations who have a budget of $17 million and more. The maximum amount that they're going to be able to spend on lobbying under the expenditure test is $1 million. So if you're over that budget amount, that might be a reason to continue under the default test, because you can hire some, you know, that's a choice to consider. But there are other benefits of the expenditure test where you can prefer the version of the expenditure. Also, under the expenditure test, there's a point out throughout how that applies. I also want to mention that we have an online calculator on our website that can help you with that formula if that is something that, if you're like me and you were told that there would be no math, maybe this will help you. So what is this? This is just kind of an example to show how the lobbying limit works for a group using the expenditure test. So let's say you have roughly $4 million of annual expenditures. And that means that a public charity of that size could spend a total of $350,000 on lobbying, which is a lot. Sham and I look at 990s all the time where people are reporting lobbying and they're rarely anywhere near their limits. We find that these limits for most organizations are very generous. Of that 350,000 total lobbying limit, up to 87,500, which is 1/4 of that amount, can be spent on grassroots lobbying. So if an organization is only doing grassroots lobbying and they never directly communicate with government officials, they would only be able to spend $87,500. If an organization was only doing direct lobbying, communicating directly with government officials and never with the general public, they could spend $350,000 on direct lobbying. So that's kind of how the math works on that limit. And I think at this point, I'll stop and see if there's any questions about the limit, choosing between the two tests, and then we'll dive in next to the definition of lobbying.
So Nona, I don't see any questions about the limit, but there's one question that's not exactly a legal question. I'm wondering if you want to answer it now. And the question is, how do you overcome an unjust bad reputation with a couple of agencies when you're doing advocacy?
Wow. You know, I'm not sure that there's one kind of short answer to that question. I'm trying to think about it. And I think maybe it really depends on what you mean by bad reputation or what people's perceptions are. You know, I think that one thing I'll refer to here, which isn't exactly a great answer either, but is the fact that we have some tools and some work that we do in Boulder Advocacy that's not just only focused on the legal rules of advocacy, but we have some advocacy capacity tools that are available for free use on our website. So ACT, Advocacy Capacity Tool, and then there's a short version. And, you know, those are great because they kind of break down advocacy into component parts. And certainly one of the component parts is about, you know, having relationships with decision makers, because ultimately, you know, there's a process and certain people have to make certain decisions. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's one thing you can do is you can work in coalition. So you can bring in other people who have the kind of trust or relationships that you don't have. And if those other parties, you know, respect you and trust you enough to work with you, then that's one way of changing the dynamic. You can, you know, hire new staff, show that you're doing something different than what they've, you know, why they have that negative perception of you in the past. So it's kind of hard to talk about that, but I will say, you know, advocacy is really about relationships. And so, you know, what do you do to change a relationship when there's been pain or a break in that relationship, or that there's not trust yet for whatever reason? I think you need to think about it in the same way. You know, if there are people who are decision makers or whose input is important to your advocacy work, you need to think about how you can either build or repair relationships with those folks to be able to be effective. So I love the question. I hope I have done it a little bit of justice. And, you know, it's great. I love talking about stuff like this.
And I will also add just that that's totally a question that I think kind of that and the access to decision makers are questions that we get at the fund quite a bit, and we're available to kind of talk through that to the degree it'd be helpful, and kind of the strategy of building those relationships or navigating that decision-making field as well.
You know, I find that just showing up is really important. Just being there, you know, at every meeting or at the office, calling, and not, you know, I'm a parent too. So someone told me recently, like, your kids want you to be there, but not in an annoying way. It's like, I had to kind of walk that line to build those relationships, to show like, look, I know what's going on. And I think also just having people who are directly affected and showing their strength and resilience and power and engagement in, you know, because it's not about you. So I don't know. Anyway, we could go on, but let's move on and talk about the definition of lobbying, and then we can revisit any of these questions that are rising up further. So the definition of lobbying. Now this, again, I just want to kind of situate us that this definition is for public charities who are using the expenditure test. So if you're under the default test, you remember at the beginning of the session, I said the definition of lobbying, or the unofficial definition of lobbying, is trying to influence legislation. That's kind of where you start and end if you're under the default test. So there's not going to be as much specificity to what counts as lobbying. I think under the default test, and that's one of the kind of drawbacks of it, is that anything in the ballpark of trying to influence legislation, for the most part, is going to count as lobbying. There are some exceptions to that, and for those of you, if you need to be under the expenditure test or you have questions about that, we can answer those. But I want to focus in on the specific definition of lobbying under the expenditure test. And so, as I mentioned, there's two different kinds of lobbying that the IRS defines. And the first is that we're going to talk about is called direct lobbying. And then we'll talk about grassroots lobbying. And the factors of the definitions are on the left-hand side of the page. So, and there's me lobbying my one of my elected representatives at the bottom of the slide there. So direct lobbying is a communication with a government official that expresses a view about specific legislation. So you have to have, for both of these, you have to have all of the elements for it to count as lobbying. So a communication can be any kind of communication. And, you know, we used to go to meetings in person. We used to go to public hearings in person. Now we're doing a lot more digital advocacy, right? But social media and online communication are forms of communication. So lobbying can happen on social media, on the internet, etc. Certainly phone calls, letters, all that stuff counts, can be lobbying if it's with a government official and expressing a view about specific legislation. So government official, who am I talking about here? Well, mostly I'm talking about legislators. Legislators include, of course, you know, the US Congress, our state legislature, county boards of supervisors, city councils, tribal councils. Those are really the only groups that the IRS considers to be a legislature. And we'll come back to why that's important later. But we're not only really concerned about legislators here, we're also concerned about any other government official or employee who helps to create new laws. So that would include the staff of a legislator. It would also include, for instance, our governor or our president when they are mayors, because they're helping to make new laws by either signing them or vetoing them, right? So they have an important role to play in the legislative process. Also, interestingly, as I mentioned, even at the top, the IRS considers ballot measures, weighing in to support or oppose ballot measures, to be lobbying. And right, because it's about making a policy, it's about making a new law. And when, for groups that are under the expenditure test, the IRS says that ballot measure work is direct lobbying, not grassroots lobbying, because even though we're talking to the general public are the lawmakers, because they're actually voting on whether or not to have a certain new law. So interestingly, it's a bit of a counterintuitive, but ballot measure work counts as direct lobbying, which is nice because, as you remember from our from the limits, that we can do more direct lobbying than grassroots lobbying. So what is expressing a view about specific legislation?
Nona,
Well, yeah.
Sorry to just jump in. Just
No.
related to ballot measures, we actually had a workshop in September of last year that covered this a little bit more in depth. And I know we have some resources and recordings on that topic as well that I'd be happy to share with folks afterwards as well.
Yes. We spend a lot of time at Boulder Advocacy, especially our California team, working on ballot measures. And so if you have any questions about that, both under the IRS framework and then also, oh, they're literally doing construction right outside my room now. There's also California law for those who are doing a lot of ballot measure work that applies. And so we work on that as well here at Boulder Advocacy if you have questions about that. Ballot measures are specific legislation, as I just mentioned, but what else counts as legislation? So certainly we know that bills, ordinances, motions count as specific legislation. So I have an image here of HR 5492, an act to repeal the Selective Service registration draft requirement. But whether or not a bill is either at the federal level, state, city, county, if it's something that the legislature is voting on, then it counts as legislation. Also, whether or not it's introduced, it counts as legislation as long as it's specific. I'm using air quotes, specific, which is a generous concept. So just suffice to say, if you have something written up that you're asking a legislator to propose, you're probably lobbying. That's probably specific enough. Another thing that's really important right now, and on always every year, are our federal, state, and local budgets. And those are legislative documents, those budgets that are voted on, again, by Congress, by the state legislature, by the city council or county boards of supervisors. Those are legislative documents. So when you're weighing in on those budgets and you're asking for, specific line item, things to be included in the budget, then that is likely to be lobbying. And another thing that's really happening right now is that, especially at the federal level, the Senate is being asked to confirm a lot of folks to the cabinet. We're hoping to see a lot of federal judges come up for confirmation soon. So that is actually also something that nonprofits can weigh in on, and it counts as lobbying because the Senate is voting on it. And so again, really the definition comes down to if the Senate is voting, if the state legislature is voting, city council, county board, it's probably legislation. And so it's probably lobbying if you're communicating, if you're expressing a view about it. But there are lots of rules out there and policies that impact our communities in really important ways that are not legislative. So agency regulations, for example, executive orders, executive actions, enforcing existing laws, whether through litigation or some other kind of enforcement activity, that's not about a legislature coming together and passing a new law, making a new law. It's really about how federal agencies or the executive enforce the laws that are already on the books. And so that just does not count under the IRS framework as lobbying, which is puts it in that field of all those green activities that you can do as much as you want. So kind of guiding our thought about this, groups who are not legislative include the police, the sheriff, district attorney, school boards, other kinds of special purpose bodies. Even though the school board is elected, the sheriff or the district attorney is elected, they're just not considered to be legislative by the IRS. So when these folks are acting under the jurisdiction that they already have under, whether it's the Constitution or some other state or federal law, they're acting within that. When we're trying to influence that, it's not legislative, it's not lobbying. So we have some examples to talk about that here, but just underlining, there's a lot of work that can be done on issues like environmental protection, issues around, you know, the racial implications of mass incarceration and policing that just are not legislative. So we can really do as much as we want in those areas. And then one note is that preparation for lobbying counts as lobbying. When you're specifically preparing those talking points for that Zoom public hearing you're about to attend, or you're training folks on what to say, that preparation for a specific lobbying communication is also lobbying. So when we get to thinking about staff time, that's an important concept. So I'm going to give a couple examples here and then we can take some questions. So get ready to go into your chat box, or if you're feeling brave and you want to unmute yourself and give me an answer out loud, you can do that. So the question is this lobbying? Asking your US representative to support a bill that calls for the elimination of the draft. What do you think? Is this lobbying? All right, Nadia's brave. Nadia said yes. Jennifer said yes. All right, the answers are rolling in. Yes, indeed. Yes, yes. Okay. Yes, I agree. That is lobbying. Perfect. So let's look at maybe a little bit harder example. Next one. We have here a discussion of a certain line item in the budget of City of Santa Barbara, and there's going to be a $50,000 cut to services for people without homes. And let's say in this scenario, by the way, I'm using real graphics that I found, but I'm making up the scenario. So if you're seeing your own stuff there, just keep in mind, it's a little bit made up here. So I don't want anyone to panic, or hopefully also, when I share these, I think I'm sharing them because they're great and wonderful advocacy. So it's a shout out from me. So if you're urging your city council member not to make this proposed $50,000 cut in the city budget for services for people who do not have housing, is that lobbying? What do folks think?
Some yeses.
All right. We think so. We think so. Yes. Yeah. So we're communicating with the city council member And we're saying, hey, don't make this $50,000 cut in this line item. That is lobbying. You got it. Okay, so here is an example. This is one of our statewide ballot measures from September. And this one pager says, Proposition 20 would set us back into a flawed system that focuses on harsh punishments instead of rehabilitation and reentry services. We cannot afford to continue to spend an endless amount of resources to incarcerate and punish individuals. So what do you think about this one? Is this lobbying? Okay, propositions are to the voters, not the representatives. That's right. Also, it doesn't specifically say how to vote. All right, so we're going to go, we don't think so. So I'm going to go back over the definition of lobbying. So this is a communication, right? This one pager, presumably handed out to or the general public or posted online, more likely, right? So it's a communication to the general public. Let's assume that this this group is under the expenditure test, right? Now a ballot measure is legislation. So hopefully I made that clear earlier on. So ballot measure is legislation. So then the only question is, does it express a view? And I really like Nadia's comment because I think that is really people's expectation that unless you're saying vote yes or vote no, that you're not lobbying around a ballot measure. But the standard is, are you expressing a view? And now this is not a black or white example. I put it in here for the sake of discussion, but I think that this expresses a view, even though it doesn't specifically say how to vote. Do you all know how Unite LA wants you to vote on Prop 20 from reading this? I think you do. And here's why you know, because it talks about a flawed system. It talks about spending an endless amount of resources to incarcerate and punish, right? It's not truly endless. There is a certain amount of money there. I'm sure there's a legislative estimate of how much this would cost over time, right? So it's not that it's inaccurate. It's that this is advocacy language, right? This is appealing to what's harsh, what's flawed, what's wrong, what's endless, like these adjectives, right? It's not just factual. So it is possible to have a factual one sheet about a ballot measure. But the question is not just, does it say vote yes or vote no? It's really all about the tone and the kind of language that you use and whether you express a view. So I'm sorry if that was kind of a trick question, but thank you for having that conversation with me because again, you know, this is a little close to the line. I don't want to scare you off from having this kind of thing because also you're allowed to lobby. So remember that. But, you know, it's the kind of thing that maybe we can help support you if you really need it to not be lobbying for some reason or just to know how to count it. Having a conversation with our staff on our technical assistance line. All right, so let's look at any more questions about that one?
Not seeing any right now.
Okay, I'll move on to the next example. Okay, so this one is, we're talking to the county sheriff and we want the county sheriff to do two things. We want them to sign a letter to the County Board of Supervisors asking for $2 million for after-school programs in the county budget. And we're asking them to stop reporting undocumented immigrants to ICE. What do you think about this one? Is this lobbying? All right. Some people are saying no. Laura, or anyone who wants to jump in, why do you think it's not? Some people are saying
Well,
could be.
I guess primarily my first thing was because it was going to an LEO. And that you had stated that LEOs are not, when you contact them or approach them, that that's not lobbying. And
Right.
you're asking him to sign a letter not to pass legislation or what have you. So that's why, those are the main reasons why. You're just making a request that he do something, and you're not, it doesn't have anything legislative oriented.
Okay. That's great. That's that gets us partway through the answer. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. So this is getting into the complexity, right? So you are right that the county sheriff is not a legislator, but the county sheriff is a government official who may help with the process of creating new laws. So the question really is the policy that you're trying to impact legislation? It's not so much about the person, the sheriff, it's about the policy. And we have two different policies we're talking about here. So, having that $2 million line item in the county budget, is that legislative? It is. We just had that example, right? So that policy is legislative. And even if you're talking to a government official and you're asking them to weigh in with their colleagues about legislation, that you should probably count as lobbying. But the other piece about not reporting undocumented immigrants to ICE, that's not something that the county board has to vote on. That's something that is totally within, right? Barry says it's attempting to influence the board of supervisors, even though you're doing it through the county sheriff. But this other piece about not reporting undocumented folks is something that is totally within the jurisdiction of the county sheriff to choose how they move forward. And so that piece would not be lobbying, because that's not, like I said, it's not something that the county board or any other legislature is going to vote on. So basically, I want to clarify with this example that it's most important to understand that whether the policy you're working on is legislation or not. As opposed to specifically who you're talking to, because I know that you all get very creative in your advocacy and you bring in any support that you can garner, right, for the policy that you're trying to win. And then also another aspect of this example is that not every expenditure that might relate to lobbying has to be 100% lobbying. So sometimes it could be half and half. And when you're getting into the more advanced like questions about how to report this stuff, you know, I think when you're just starting, you're count it 100% lobbying, that's great. But if you get to a certain point, you're up against your limits and you're realizing maybe we could count half of this time as lobbying and the other half not as lobbying, because there's two different asks in this letter, right? It would be more important if it were a larger expenditure than a letter. But just to get to that idea that you can allocate the costs to lobbying in a reasonable way. Okay, so here's an example where we are demanding that Governor Newsom and the Department of, CDCR, I'm not going to remember the whole acronym, Division of Juvenile Justice, take action to release youth in state custody because of COVID outbreak in the jails and prisons. So we demand that kind of action. What do folks think? Is that lobbying or not? All right, so it's definitely policy change. That's right. So is this something that so this is a state level question. David is asking a good question. Is there pending legislation? Is executive action? It's not legislative. So in the example I'm giving, I am kind of assuming that there's not pending legislation and that this is just an action that the state agency or the governor could take on their own to say, look, we have to let folks out of these jails and prisons to protect them. So that, because there's no legislature voting on it, is not lobbying under IRS rules. So it's not every single policy change that is lobbying. It is the ones, yeah, you did it. Nice, pass the test. Very good. So this is not, like I said, not legislative. Great job, folks. So before I move on and talk about the definition of grassroots lobbying, do you think there's anything we should clarify, Sean or Stanley?
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions, Nona, about influencing budgets. And I know you talked about that, but I'm wondering about if an organization wanted to influence an agency decision around their budget, how they spend funds that have already been appropriated to the agency.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to just
I would also just
tell the answer to that question while I drink some water, Sean?
Sure. Yeah. So as Nona talked about, if you're influencing a legislative body around a budget, for example, the County Board of Supervisors, City Council, or the state legislature, then those advocacy efforts will be lobbying under IRS rules. But if you're trying to influence what an agency can do with the funds that have already been allocated to the agency, then that will be administrative advocacy, not legislative advocacy.
And I
So
just,
not lobbying.
I think you might have answered this earlier, but what about school board budgets?
Yeah, that's the same as an administrative agency budget. Because for whatever reason, I know it's an elected, it's a body of people who make decisions, but the IRS just says it doesn't count. So, if we're talking about, again, state or county having to allocate funds to a school district, that would count, but the school district budget itself does not count. So, I'm from LA. We have our own school police department in Los Angeles. Just like let that sink in. And there's been a lot of activism over the last year or two. And we've done some great work of cutting that budget. We haven't gotten rid of it yet, but we've cut it significantly. And that's not lobbying because it's a school board budget. So yeah, big exception. All right, great. Let's talk a little bit about grassroots lobbying because that's my favorite kind, because I think that is where we really have our power together as all the people power. So grassroots lobbying is something, again, this definition only specifically applies to you under the expenditure test, but this kind of activity would still count as lobbying under the default test. It would probably be even broader. But so grassroots lobbying is communication with the general public. Again, we're expressing a view about specific legislation, but since we are only talking about things now passed by legislators. Remember, we're not talking, ballot measures count under direct lobbying. So we're talking only about things that the general public can't themselves vote on. And for that reason, there's this extra piece under the expenditure test definition for grassroots lobbying. For something to count as lobbying, it has to have a call to action. And there's some specific things, only 4 specific things that count as a call to action in this context, right? So they are telling people to contact their legislators, providing contact information for legislators, providing a mechanism to contact legislators, or identifying legislators as being opposed to your view or undecided. And so those are the only 4 things under the expenditure test that count as calls to action. So let's look at some examples just to make this real. Here we have something that says call to action, stand with DACA recipients. But really the reason why this is a call to action is not because it uses the words call to action. It's because it says call our representatives and urge them. Below it also says call on Congress. So just saying that, even if it doesn't have a petition, even if it doesn't have the phone number, that's a call to action. This is a different example. It doesn't say who you're calling, but it does have a phone number. So this is contact information, presumably for your legislator to pass the Clean Dream Act. Here's an example of a mechanism to contact your legislator. So support the Debt-Free College Act of 2019. We're expressing a view about specific legislation, but we're also generating an email, right? So I don't know about you, but my inbox is full of these things and they count as grassroots lobbying for a nonprofit who is using them, as long as we're talking again about legislative change. Now let's look at this example. This is a social media post. It says, we support the Restart Act. And it talks about the Restart Act. It has generous loan terms. It has forgiveness based on revenue declines. I'm really missing my in-person music, as you can tell. So, so this actually does not have a call to action. It does not encourage people to contact their legislators. It does not give contact information for legislators. It does not have a mechanism to contact legislators, and it doesn't name any legislators as being opposed to the Restart Act or undecided about the Restart Act. So guess what? It's not lobbying at all. So this is where, this is my new thing about how to explain this concept. You can't make a chocolate cake without chocolate. So you have to have all the ingredients of grassroots lobbying for something to count as lobbying. And if you don't have a call to action, then it's not lobbying, which means you can express a view about legislation to the general public. If you're under the expenditure test, you will not have to count those expenditures if you don't make a call to action. Now, is it going to be more effective if you do make a call to action? Yes. Should you make a call to action? Yes, because you want to impact the legislation. So when you do that, put all the calls to action in there, right? So here's an example. Tell your senators to support the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This bill centers the needs of low-income and vulnerable families in the response to COVID-19. We have Senator Dianne Feinstein. We have her phone number. We have a call script. After calling, please tweet at your senator at Senator Feinstein. This is communication with the general public. Let's presume this is like a social media post. It expresses a view about specific legislation, support the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and it's full of calls to action. It says, tell your senators. It has the phone number. It has Senator Feinstein's Twitter handle. It has a script. This is great because this means people are more likely to actually take action. When I see there's a script, I'm like, great, I can read that. I'm going to do it right now, right? That's amazing. Put them all in. It still only counts as grassroots lobbying one time. If you only say, tell your senators to support the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, then I'm like, okay, what's Dianne Feinstein's phone number? What should I say about it, right? But it still counts as grassroots lobbying. So this is, sorry, I went faster than I meant to. That was an example of grassroots lobbying. But then we have a different example, still about how we support the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and all the great things that it does. But again, no call to action. It doesn't talk about Dianne Feinstein. It doesn't give the phone numbers, and it doesn't say to contact your senator. So that would not count as lobbying, because it's also not a communication directly with a government official. So it's not direct lobbying. It's not grassroots lobbying. It's not lobbying. It doesn't mean, again, you can lobby. So I'm not suggesting that it's best to take out these calls to action. I'm just suggesting that it's important to know whether a particular communication is lobbying or not, so you can track it appropriately. I want you to be most effective and put those calls to action in there and make change for sure. So let's look at this example. What do you guys think here? Is this lobbying? We have a nonprofit that retweeted this tweet, and it says, federal paid sick leave for COVID-19 expired for tens of millions of low-wage workers like us on January 1st. It's inexcusable and dangerous. We demand paid sick leave beyond the pandemic and beyond. Protect all workers. So what do you think about this? All right, so we have questions. Oh, we got the leaf blower unmute. So whoever had that on their bingo card can check that off. So I'll go ahead and answer Athena's question, which is yes. Let's say you're the nonprofit who retweeted this. If that means that the IRS sees it as you communicating the message. So if this is lobbying, and you retweet it, that's a lobbying expense. Now, it's not a lot of a lobbying expense because I don't know how much staff time went into you retweeting that. If you had to have a meeting about whether or not to retweet it, then maybe, that counts. But, I try to just, if I'm going to do some lobbying tweeting or posting in a week, I try to just make sure I spend a whole half hour on it so I get my money's worth. I have to put it on my timesheet, so I'm going to definitely spend 30 minutes. What else can I retweet? So it's not expensive, right, to retweet, but it does count. It does count. But what do you think about this? Okay, so some folks are saying not lobbying, no specific call to action. There's nothing directed at a legislator. The question is there a call to action? It doesn't seem so. Not lobbying. Yay, you win. You got it. No call to action here. So it's very strongly stated. It's saying what we want and what our position is about specific legislation, but there's no call to action. So it's not lobbying. All right. So I want to talk a tiny bit about some lobbying exceptions, and then we're going to take the last few minutes for questions. And I can even stay a little longer if necessary, but just want to mention a couple exceptions. Really, so the most important ones here are going to be the first two: nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, or request for technical assistance. So nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. is this idea. It's going to typically be something like a report, and it can be an analysis of a policy issue, right? Either kind of the problems that lead to the need for the policy solution, or kind of an analysis of the impact of a particular policy solution. If you do that kind of analysis, and it's a full and fair discussion about the policy, and you disseminate that broadly, you put it on the internet, if you give it directly to legislators, you give it like to the whole committee that's voting, the whole legislature, if you're in, you know, the full body, then you actually can express a view kind of as maybe a conclusion, right? Or an executive summary. You know, let's imagine this issue brief that talks about California's 17 million renters, says in the conclusion or the executive summary, therefore, this is why the legislature should pass additional rental protections, right? Or should pass, I forget the number of this, SB 91 or something. So, you know, if you have all those facts in there in a way that people can draw their own conclusions, or maybe you've addressed some counter arguments, then this report in and of itself doesn't have to count as lobbying, as long as you're not using it really mostly for grassroots lobbying. And another great exception to use is if you get an invitation in writing from a government body and you respond by making your response available to that entire committee or whatever, you can do what otherwise would definitely be lobbying, and it just doesn't count. So yeah, so if you get those invitations in writing, that's a great place to be. So I'm gonna do my wrap-up slides, and then we're just gonna take questions. So we have lots of resources. Stanley's gonna send some out to you after the session. Even more on our website, including our new podcast called Rules of the Game, where you can hear Sham Subramanian's dulcet tones, as well as many of my other colleagues. So if you're a podcast person, definitely check that out. We talked about keeping track, which gets into the record keeping questions. We even have materials in Spanish. So key points today. 501c3 public charities can and should lobby. I'm going to tell you what to do. You should lobby. And to do it, you need to stay within your annual lobbying limits. You need to track your lobbying, and you need to report your lobbying on your annual 990. Knowing these definitions of lobbying will make it much easier for you to do that reporting. And many of the activities that influence policy do not count as lobbying, as we talked about, especially those administrative policies. And please contact us on our hotline for help. So with that, let's turn back to another question or two.
Sure. So there are three questions. One is about the self-defense exception and whether that would apply when you're advocating for funding for your own organization.
So sadly, no, it would not, because it is only, it's very narrowly defined to apply to an organization's powers, duties, and tax exempt status. So it is the section that, for instance, allows private foundations to go every year on Foundations on the Hill and talk about what the rules should be for tax deductions and things like that, because that relates to tax exempt status. But funding, which you would think we in the nonprofit sector know that that is key to our existence, but there actually is guidance that says even if they're zeroing out your 100% funding stream, that's not about your powers, duties, or existence. So it's not, it wouldn't apply just to issues that relate to your funding stream. When there's new rules proposed for what nonprofits have to do or don't have to do, that's more like the kind of thing that would apply. It's pretty narrow, but feel free to ask us questions as things come up.
Great. Another question is, if we are advocating to change the requirements to become a board member, would that be lobbying? Who makes the choice to change those requirements?
So I think generally, well, it depends because, for instance, we did recently pass legislation in California that said that 50% of people on corporate boards have to be women, right? So the state legislature could weigh in on something like that. Typically, states regulate corporate law. But if you're just talking about your organization, then that's the board of directors that would decide what the rules are for being a board, unless you have a membership structure. I don't want to get too complicated with it, but so it depends on that. But if it is something that is being voted on by the state legislature, county board, or city council, then it would be legislative, and it could be lobbying.
Great. Another question is, what about for organizations that are fiscally sponsored by a 501c3?
Great question. It depends. So you're typically speaking, if you're doing a standard fiscal sponsorship kind of arrangement, this will all be governed and reported by your fiscal sponsor. So if your fiscal sponsor is under the expenditure test, they will ask you just to report expenditures, or they may ask you whatever they want, because they may have other kinds of reporting responsibilities that are beyond the IRS. But just to know that it would be wrapped in with their reporting. So if they're under the default test, you're under the default test. If they're under the expenditure test, you're under that. They will ask you, they should be asking you for some kind of information about lobbying. And if they're not, then I'm afraid they don't know these rules, and we'd be happy to work with them to make sure that they do learn about them and get the information they need to comply.
And there are a couple other questions, but I did want to mention, in case people need to hop off, that we would appreciate it if you could complete a short survey, which I've put in the chat. So the next question is, do we have reporting obligations on our California tax returns?
And sorry, I wanted to just, for those that do have to sign off, I just wanted to just share really quickly that, yeah, just want to really just provide a brief shout out to the fund's supporters, including our donors and foundation supporters, like the McCune Foundation, the Hunt Parker and Bauer Foundations, and more. And just a brief shout out for everybody in this room. This discussion wouldn't be relevant without the great work that I know all of you all are a part of out in the community. So thanks for taking the time on this topic. You do have to sign up. And of course, yeah, to you, Nona, and Shame and the rest of the team, just want to reiterate my thanks before folks sign up. But thank you also for sticking around a little bit longer to answer some of these great questions.
Great, thank you.
Sure. And I actually don't know the answer to that question, believe it or not. It's not a separate restriction. I think that if anything, you would be putting in the same information. In general, there's conformance. It's not always true, but there are not separate tax reporting or tax restrictions in the state of California for nonprofits. There are California rules that relate to people that do a lot of advocacy at the state level. So if you're doing a lot of state advocacy, not local, but state advocacy, hit us up and we will give you kind of a framework of like whether or not you need to be thinking about that.
The final question I see is, if we have a conversation with our board members or with organizers about legislation, when is that lobbying?
Great question. So I think that's really only lobbying if you're preparing to lobby, because internal conversations are not communications with government officials, certainly. But if it's a meeting about, oh, okay, we have this meeting with Senator Hannah Beth Jackson coming up. What will be the most appealing talking points for her about this policy we're trying to pass? That would be preparation for lobbying, right? But the IRS actually does have a consideration of membership, that if the folks you're talking to are people who are really internal to your organization, they commit more than just a tiny bit of time or money to your organization, then even if they're not staff, they are really an internal audience. So those conversations wouldn't count as grassroots lobbying. Something that otherwise might seem like grassroots lobbying would really be direct lobbying, just because it would be attributed to being internal if those folks really are more of an internal audience. So again, some of our publications go into more detail about that. Definitely in the being a player publication, we have some details about membership and how that minimizes what needs to be reported, especially as grassroots lobbying.
And that's all I see for now, but people can always, I see another one, but people can always email us for technical assistance.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Stanley, do you want to go ahead and sign off? I mean, I'm still available, but I just want to do a time check.
Yeah, totally. I think if you are still available, I can go ahead and end our recording and as long as that makes sense.